And we're starting with metaethics. For those of you who were here last week, I explained what metaethics is. It's kind of an overwhelming term. It's not a term you hear very often. We're all very used to ethics, right? So we have a lot of discussions about ethical issues, abortion, euthanasia, the death penalty, and ethical conversations are just normative ethics, is about whether something, a particular activity or action is right or wrong. Whereas metaethics is a little bit deeper. It's about more foundational issues, if you will. But it's issues that oftentimes people don't discuss. But we're going to do so here. So in metaethics, some of the issues are, is there even such a thing as objective moral truth? Or is our moral beliefs just subjective feelings and opinions? Is morality just subjective? So that's a discussion in metaethics. If there is such a thing as objective moral truth, how can we know it? What faculties do we have, or what sort of experiments can we do to figure out moral truth, if in fact there is such a thing? That's a big issue in metaethics. And then kind of what we're focusing on right now is what makes something morally good or bad. And there's a lot of theories out there about what makes something morally good or bad. And as I noted, this is different than whether something is good or bad. Sometimes people disagree on what makes something bad, though they agree that it is bad. For like example, rape. Most everybody agrees that rape is morally bad, but they might disagree on what makes it bad. As I mentioned last week, there are a lot of atheists who agree with Christians that only God could provide a foundation for objective morality. So these atheists, they don't believe that there is a God, of course, but they agree that only God could provide a foundation for it. And these atheists would just say, since there is no God, therefore there is no objective morality. I also mentioned that there are a lot of atheists, and it's becoming more and more popular, who disagree, who say, wait a second, not so fast. Maybe objective morality can exist without God, without a foundation. And one of the biggest names in this arena, this area, this position, is G.E. Moore. And his book, as I noted last week in 1903, has been just a huge influence in this conversation. So a lot of people refer to, even if they disagree with him, it's kind of the high water mark, at least, when it comes to this position of objective morality existing without a foundation. As I said, this particular atheistic position has exploded really in popularity lately. In the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a huge surge. And I noted several of the names in this position who affirm this position, one of them being Erik Wielenberg. And that's who we're bringing to UNL at the end of this month. And him and I are going to have a dialogue up on stage. Matt's going to be the moderator, and I'm really looking forward to that. I would consider Dr. Wielenberg a friend. Him and I have done quite a few things together. Our book that we wrote together just came out last month. So I'm really excited to bring him here to UNL. Well, of all these different folks that affirm this position, why focus on Wielenberg? Well, here's one of the reasons. As William Lane Craig pointed out, William Lane Wielenberg has really emerged as one of the most important contemporary critics of theistic metaethics. Okay? I'll find the quote. I thought I had it next on the slide, but I don't. So Wielenberg has emerged as one of the most important critics of theistic positions. So not only is he arguing, Wielenberg, for his atheistic theory, he is arguing against other theories, one of them being Christianity or supernatural. realism, as we talked about last week. Well, he calls his theory godless normative realism. So I'll try not to use that term because it's a mouthful tonight. I'll just call it Wielenberg's theory. But he calls it godless normative realism. And his theory, basically, in a nutshell, is that objective morality exists even though God does not. That sounded like me. It's working. So here's a quote from him. Wielenberg, this is from his book. And this is the book of his that I'll be referring to mostly. He's published a lot, mostly with Cambridge University Press, Oxford University Press. But this book is probably his main one, I would say. It's called Robust Ethics, the Metaphysics and Epistemology of Godless Normative Realism. So that's the name of his theory right there in the title of the book, Robust Ethics. And this is a quote from that book. He says, "Whereas proponents of theistic approaches to moral realism seek to make God the foundation of objective moral truth, I argue that it's at least as plausible to construe objective moral truth as not needing an external foundation at all." So plausibility is a key word you're going to hear a lot. And this is just a common strategy in these sort of conversations, really in all philosophy, right, is plausibility points. There's a lot of theories. I mean, a lot of things are possible, but what's really the most plausible? Okay? It's a little bit different than a deductive argument or even an inductive argument, because we're talking about inference to the best explanation, more of abductive reasoning. You know, what's most plausible here? What makes the most sense given all the data that we're working with or that we see? So here's the roadmap for tonight. Here's what we're going to do. I want to explain Wielenberg's theory, and there's three main features of it, and then I'm going to provide two objections to Wielenberg's theory. Okay? So I know for sure we'll get through at least the first objection, and if we have time, I don't want to overwhelm you guys, but if we have time, we'll go through the second one as well. But I thought if nothing else, this would be useful for us just as we prepare to have him here to the university to speak here in a few weeks. Okay? So tonight we're just focused on Wielenberg's theory, his godless normative realism, as he calls it. And the first major feature of his theory is his brute ethical facts. Okay, and I'm going to give you a lot of quotes because I want you to see from his own words what he is explaining and describing. All right? I don't want to filter it through my understanding. I want to give you straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak, what Wielenberg is saying. So here's his explanation of these brute ethical facts, okay? He says, such facts are the foundation of the rest of objective morality, and they rest on no foundation themselves. So to ask of such facts, where do they come from, on what foundation do they rest, is misguided. Note this. It's misguided in much the same way that, according to many theists, it's misguided to ask of God, where does he come from? Or on what foundation does he rest? Well, the answer is the same in both cases. Obviously, he's an atheist, but the answers that theists and the answer that he gives about his brute ethical facts is the same. They come from nowhere. And nothing external to themselves grounds their existence. Rather, they're fundamental features of the universe that ground other truths. So that's how he explains, in a nutshell, his brute ethical facts. Okay? Now, you might be having some red flags or some bells going off in your mind because for those of you who know a little bit about this conversation, the way he describes brute ethical facts sounds oftentimes like he's describing Platonic abstract objects. So if you know much about Plato's theory, if you know much about abstract objects, in fact, Wielenberg uses that term abstract objects in Platonism quite a bit in his book and in his speaking. It sounds very much like he's describing these brute ethical facts as Platonic abstract objects. Now, if you're not familiar with that conversation, let me just bring you up to speed real quick. I'll make this very simple. I tried to lay out just a chart here, and In this conversation, there's a discussion about abstract objects and concrete objects. And folks would say that everything is either one or the other. Okay? If abstract objects in fact exist. There were some people who would say, no, there are no abstract objects, there are only concrete objects, right? So what's the difference? That's what I'm trying to get to with this slide. What's the difference? Sometimes people think the difference is that abstract objects are timeless and immaterial. And that's what makes them different than concrete objects. But that's not the case. That's where there's some confusion here. Because there are some concrete objects that are timeless or immaterial. So what's probably a bigger distinction between the two categories is this third one, whether or not they have causal powers. Whether they can enter into the causal chain of events. Okay? So if Plato was correct, that there are these abstract objects out there, things like the property of redness, mathematical truths, objective truths, if there are such abstract objects that exist, they can't cause anything. They can't act or enter into the chain of causes, like concrete objects can, okay? And so obviously, even within concrete objects, there's disagreement as to what could exist, right? Some people believe there is a God, some people believe there are angels, others don't. But if they do exist, they would be in that category, concrete objects, even though they're timeless, God, immaterial, God, but he's a causal agent. Therefore, he would be a concrete object. He can cause things, such like angels can, okay? So that's just kind of a very simple distinction between these two things. And what Wielenberg is positing then is that there are moral truths out there, these brute ethical facts that exist, kind of like Plato's abstract objects that Plato put out there. Wielenberg admits this himself. He said, if we want to situate my view in the history of philosophy, I think it's very Morean. We've talked about that, G.E. Moore. And it's also Platonic. People sometimes use Platonic like a type of criticism, but I embrace the label. So he admits this isn't something I'm projecting on him. William Lane Craig summarized his position like this. Craig said, Wielenberg espouses what I have elsewhere called atheistic moral Platonism. That is to say, Wielenberg takes moral values and duties to be identical to certain independently existing abstract objects. His view, then, is akin to mathematical Platonism, which holds that in addition to the world of concrete objects, apples, angels, planets, there exists an independent realm of immaterial, causally effet, I think it's pronounced, non-causal, abstract objects like numbers, sets, and other mathematical entities. So Wielenberg wants to affirm the objectivity and even necessity of moral values and duties, and so he must find some transcendent ground for them, and he finds this in his moral Platonism. Now, Wielenberg isn't the only one, right? I mean, he's called his theory godless normative realism, but as I've said, there are other atheist philosophers who affirm other theories very similar to this. One of them we talked about last week is David Enoch. And he also describes his theory in Platonic terms. He wrote that his model is a form of robust realism, this non-natural realism, robust realism. And he noted, I will not be offended if you call me a Platonist. Later, Enoch wrote in his book, maybe with a bit of sarcasm, that according to robust realism, the normative truths, the ethical truths that are out there, they're out there, as it were, in Plato's heaven, utterly independent of us and our motivations. So everybody who's espousing this sort of a theory admits that it's very Platonic, these abstract objects. So that's the first part of Wielenberg's theory I wanted to tell you guys about. The second part is called his making relationship. Wielenberg's making relationship. Now this is a mouthful, okay? I'm just going to say this and then I'm going to explain it. But here's how he puts it. So there's natural non-moral properties that make moral properties become instantiated. Everybody got it? It took me a while to really get my head around what he's saying here. And just because something's complicated doesn't mean it's false. It's just one of those things you have to think about for a while. But he describes this making relationship as a type of causation. Okay? So take a look at this quote. He says, whatever moral properties are instantiated, come to be, are conserved or sustained by various underlying non-moral properties via a robust causal relation, that's why it's called robust realism, that holds between the relevant non-moral and moral properties. Now I'm going to give you a long quote here, but I think it's very, very useful. Okay, I think in this particular quote, Wielenberg sums up very well what he means by this making relationship. Okay? He summarized it well when he responded to the question, what is the source of human moral rights and obligations? Okay, so this is the question he's responding to in his book. What is the source of human moral rights and obligations? Here's his answer. I think it explains the making relationship really well. He wrote, any being that can reason, suffer, experience happiness, tell the difference between right and wrong, choose between right and wrong, and set goals for itself has certain rights, including the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and certain moral obligations, including the duty to refrain from rape. Having such cognitive capacities makes one have such rights and duties. That's his making relationship. Evolutionary processes have produced human beings that can reason, suffer, experience happiness, tell the difference between right and wrong, choose between right and wrong, set goals for themselves. So in this way, evolutionary processes have endowed us with the certain unalienable rights and duties. Basically, if somebody has the cognitive faculties such that they can do these things, then that makes them have moral rights and duties. Evolution has given us these moral properties by giving us the non-moral properties, cognitive faculties, able to think, make decisions, that make such moral properties come about, be instantiated. And if, as I believe, there is no God, then it is some sense an accident that we have the moral properties that we do. But that they are accidental in origin does not make these moral properties unreal or unimportant. Big quote, but I think he summarizes it well right there. Now, one other thing about this making relationship, he proposes that just like the brute ethical facts, it ultimately has no foundation or explanation. Okay? So he says something very similar to what he said about brute ethical facts. He says, explanation must come to an end somewhere. Why does being an instance of torturing someone just for fun entail moral wrongness? Well, because being an instance of torturing someone just for fun makes an act wrong. Eventually, we just hit rock bottom, and no further explanation is available. But I don't see why possessing this sort of explanatory bottom is a problematic feature for a view to have. And a lot of times he'll push this back on theists. You know, you have God as your ultimate, and I have these brute ethical facts. Neither of them have a foundation, neither of them have an explanation, they're just there. And he'll kind of use that strategy to try to argue that his theory is just as plausible as a theistic theory. Now, many have pointed out, many Christians and atheists have pointed out that these two things, these two features of his theory, these brute ethical facts and this making relationship, don't seem to fit very well with naturalism. Okay? But Wielenberg has a very simple, effective reply to that. He's not a naturalist. So we could spend all day trying to argue that these things don't fit good with naturalism, but he just says, that's fine, because I'm not a naturalist. So let me explain what this means in the conversation. A lot of times people will associate atheism with naturalism. I do it too. I'm guilty of it. We just use these two terms interchangeably. Atheism is naturalism. Naturalism is atheism. But if we want to be more precise, that's technically incorrect. Okay, there are different forms of atheism. Naturalism being one of them. Okay, and it probably is the most common form of atheism, and that might be why they get associated with each other. So a naturalist is going to say, look, there's nothing that exists beyond the physical material universe. So if you're an atheist who's also a naturalist, you would be like Carl Sagan. You guys might remember that show Cosmos, or you might have seen reruns of it from the 80s, I think. But Carl Sagan is very famous for introducing that show every week. And when it was on, he would introduce it this way: the cosmos universe is all that is, or was, or ever will be. So he was your classic naturalist. But you can be an atheist, just believe that there is no God, and reject naturalism. In fact, that's what Wielenberg does. And more atheists are affirming this sort of atheism, an atheism that affirms non-naturalism. So a non-naturalist believes that there are things that exist beyond the physical material universe. Not God, of course, but they're open to other things like these abstract objects, or as Wielenberg is usually explaining them, brute ethical facts. So here's another good quote from Wielenberg. He says, a fundamental type of property, these brute ethical facts, are a fundamental type of property not reducible to or fully constituted by some other property. Contra the Thalians, all is not water or physical or natural. So it's not enough just to say, look, Wielenberg, these brute ethical facts, this making relationship, naturalism just can't explain those things, because he's not a naturalist. We have to go on and evaluate his proposals on their own, instead of just beating naturalism with a dead horse, or beating the dead horse of naturalism. Beating a dead horse with a dead horse. We definitely don't want to do that. All right. Other atheists who affirm this position also reject naturalism. So Enoch, as I keep using as an alternate example of this position, he also rejects it. And I think it's helpful sometimes when these atheists who reject naturalism present evidence and arguments against it. Okay? Because we still have a lot of conversations with atheists who affirm naturalism, and we can bring these atheists over to our side and say, look, no, naturalism doesn't hold water. Here's some good reasons why. But we also have to deal with the atheists who are non-naturalists as well. We can't just use them on our side and not deal with them, because they're still saying that there is no God. Okay? All right, well, I am going to shut up for a while and give you guys an opportunity to talk. So now that I've summarized Wielenberg's position, and I know I've done it quickly, but the three main features of his theory I've put out there now: brute ethical facts, the making relationship, and the fact that it's non-natural. I want you guys to discuss it. What do you agree with about his theory? What do you disagree with? And then why? You know, try to back up your disagreement with why. What reasons and evidence would you have to disagree with his theory? Any aspect of it. Or maybe there's some things you agree with it on. So discuss that. And we tried to set up the room with a few different discussion groups as best we could. So maybe two over there in the dining room, one over here. Maybe we get one or two groups over here. If Casey and Ray want to jump back with them, you could get a bigger one. It's up to you, but I'm going to give you guys a few minutes just to discuss on your own for a while. What I'll do with the rest of our time tonight is I want to propose two objections to his theory. Okay? So two objections to Wielenberg's theory. And these aren't unique to me. Other people have raised these objections, and Wielenberg knows about these objections. So I'm just going to introduce you to them, just the basic form of these objections, but know that these are ongoing conversations. So just like most things, there's back and forth. He has responses to these objections, and then people have written responses to those responses, and then he's responded to those, and so on and so forth. But I'm just going to introduce you to the objections tonight, and hopefully you guys will ask him some good questions when he speaks here in a few weeks at UNL. So a lot of people reject his theory, of course, because of its non-naturalism. So we can call this the bloated non-naturalism objection. Okay? They reject it because he proposes that there are things that exist beyond the physical material universe. Right? And for a naturalist, that's a no-no. So a lot of atheists who affirm naturalism will just flat out reject his model because it goes beyond the natural, physical, material universe. So the best way I can explain this is just to think of a funny, simple example, all right? Let's say, for instance, right now, we heard a knock at the door. Okay, and let's say the door was shut, so we couldn't see who was behind the door. And there was no window in the door, so we couldn't just see right behind it. So somebody knocked on the door. We don't know who it is, but we could, instead of answering the door, just sit down together as a group and theorize what caused the door knock, right? And we'd come up with different theories. I might say it's my daughter. She is visiting us from South Carolina, and that's my theory. Somebody else could say, well, no, I think it's the neighbor across the street who knocked on the door. Somebody else might say, no, it's Sam. Sam said he was going to be here at this time, and it just makes sense. My theory is that Sam knocked on the door. So we could have different theories, right? We could talk about which one was most plausible. Now let's say, I'm looking at Zach when I say this, let's say one of you wild, crazy people come up with a theory as follows. You say, look, my theory is that the Henry Dorley Zoo, some of the trainers there have trained a giraffe to go around and knock on doors. And I think it was the giraffe, and maybe the trainers were right there and they kind of helped the giraffe do it, but it was a giraffe who knocked on the door. Now, is that possible? Of course it's possible, right? But it's not likely. It's not a very plausible theory. And we would probably reject that theory in favor of the other ones. And that's how a naturalist thinks. So a naturalist says, look, I'm going to go with what's most plausible, what's most simple. And for you, Wielenberg, to propose all these theories of things that exist beyond the universe, that just seems like a very excessive, if I dare say, bloated theory. And my theory of naturalism is much more simple. It's just like if the neighbor across the street was knocking on the door instead of your theory about this giraffe. So we're talking about here abductive reasoning, inference to the best explanation. What's the most plausible theory? And for that reason, a lot of atheists will flat out reject his theory because it posits these extra things that they don't think are necessary to the explanation. And Wielenberg admits this. Wielenberg says by proposing both brute ethical facts and this making relation, my view is, as I would put it, ontologically well endowed. So he knows it's a bloated theory. He also wrote here, the appeal to the making relationship makes robust normative realism less attractive in some respects than at least some of its competitors. It is plausible that everything else being equal, a theory that posits more kinds of properties and relations is less attractive than a theory that posits fewer. So in this respect, I hope you understand what I'm saying here. He has to battle on two fronts, okay? Not only is he battling with theists who are saying that God is the best foundation of morality, he's also battling with his fellow atheists who are naturalists, right? So he's battling here on two fronts. Give an example of a classic atheist who's a naturalist, right? Richard Dawkins, probably the most famous atheist in the world. This is a quote from him. He says, "In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are just going to get hurt, other people are just going to get lucky. You won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice to it. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music." So this would be an atheist who's a naturalist and would just reject Wielenberg's theory because it has all these extra things out there beyond the universe, these abstract objects, brute ethical facts. And in fact, at the beginning of his book, Robust Ethics, Wielenberg says, in large part, he's writing to those atheists, trying to convince them of his view. So as I said, he's battling on two fronts, because theists also raise this objection. So like William Lane Craig, he wrote that Wielenberg's Platonism is a metaphysical view which is so extravagant, the giraffe knocking on the door, that it makes theism, which itself involves substantial metaphysical commitments, look modest by comparison. And, you know, the debate that my book is all about, between Craig and Wielenberg, Craig drives this point home a lot, saying that the theory that God exists is much more plausible than the theory that these abstract objects can exist out there by themselves. So both theists and atheists like Wielenberg are positing these two theories, and Craig just says his theory is more plausible, that there's a God who exists as opposed to these abstract objects that could exist somehow out there on their own. Now, just because people find abstract objects odd doesn't mean that they're not real, okay? There's a lot of things in reality that are very, very odd. So it's not as simple as just saying, well, that's weird, can't be true, right? It's never that simple. We've got to evaluate it on its own merits and see, you could ask the question, like we often do in Ratio Christi, what reasons and evidence do you have to believe X, Y, Z, okay? So just because it's odd doesn't mean we can dismiss it. We have to say, okay, Wielenberg, what are your reasons and evidence for believing that these brute ethical facts exist? I mean, we all seem to agree, all three of these positions, naturalists, Wielenberg, positions like Wielenberg, and theists, we all seem to agree that there's something ultimate, that there's got to be an ultimate thing, right? If for no other reason, just to avoid an infinite regress. There's got to be some ultimate thing. I think most people will give you that. Naturalists say the ultimate thing is the universe, like Carl Sagan. Folks like Wielenberg would say these brute ethical facts are what's ultimate, and us as theists, Christians, would say God's the ultimate thing, being, right? So you can ask the question, what makes the most sense? Which has the better arguments and evidence for it to be the ultimate thing? We talk about a lot in Ratio Christi and apologetics that the universe doesn't seem to be a good ultimate, right? And this is the foundation of the cosmological argument, that the universe had a beginning, therefore everything that has a beginning must have a cause, and if the universe had a beginning, then it must have a cause. It can't be the ultimate, right? That's the beginning of the cosmological argument for God. So the universe doesn't seem like a very good stopping point, a good ultimate thing. And it's also kind of difficult to argue against the idea that brute ethical facts exist because Wielenberg and others in his group don't give much evidence or argument for them. So take a look at this quote. This is from a philosopher down at Baylor, C. Stephen Evans. And Evans, writing about Wielenberg's model, he says that the claim that such moral facts are brute in nature is just put out there as an assertion, then there's really no argument that can even be refuted. And Wielenberg doesn't give much evidence or arguments. He just asserts that there are these brute ethical facts. So think about the last one then, God. And we, as theists, Christians, we try to give all sorts of reasons and evidence to believe that there is a God, right? We have the cosmological argument, teleological argument, ontological argument, the moral argument. There's several more. Those are just the basics, right? 20 plus arguments that Plantinga put together for the existence of God. I think we have a lot of lines of reason and evidence to give that there is a God. In fact, I think you'll find this interesting. Many argue that abstract objects are not a very plausible ultimate stopping point because they themselves seem to be something that cries out for explanation. Does that make sense? It's kind of like the universe. The universe seems to need an explanation or a cause behind it because it had a beginning. And similarly, abstract objects also seem to cry out for some sort of an explanation. They don't seem to be things that could exist all on their own. Evans also wrote that it seems almost irresistible for a Platonist to ask what the fact that moral truths are deep truths about the universe says about the nature of ultimate reality. So Platonism itself, in some ways, makes the world mysterious and posits features of the world that cry out for explanation. In other words, where do these abstract objects come from? How can they exist on their own? Even the very first person, Plato, as far as we know, who proposed that abstract objects exist, even he had an explanation of where they came from. He didn't think that they were ultimate. So Plato himself said the source of all the abstract objects, he called them forms, but the source of all of Plato's forms, according to Plato, was the good. And when Plato went on to describe the good, it sounded very much like how we describe God. So from the beginning of this idea of abstract objects, folks thought they were things that needed an explanation, that they were not a good ultimate. In fact, a lot of people have argued for the existence of God from abstract objects. Just like we start with the universe, with the cosmological argument, we say that there is a universe that exists, and the best explanation of the universe is that there's a God. People do the exact same thing with abstract objects. These abstract objects exist, and the best explanation for them is that there is a God. So last quote here from Evans. He wrote that many theists, in fact, have thought that Platonism itself makes far more sense in a theistic universe than it does otherwise. Since in a theistic world, the forms, like I said, Plato called them forms, do not have to be seen as independent realities, but can be understood as ideas in the divine mind. And this is what early Christian theologians would say, like Augustine. He just said, Plato had a lot of things right. And what Plato didn't know is he was just describing these forms, abstract objects, and he was right, but Plato didn't realize he was merely describing the mind of God with these universal objective truths. So my mentoring professor, I got my PhD in philosophy in May, and my mentoring professor that mentored me all the way through it, he got his PhD at Oxford and wrote his dissertation on this very topic. He made a theistic argument for God from abstract objects. That's what he wrote his dissertation on in Oxford. So the fact that these thinkers, people like Plato, people like Evans, people like Dr. Welty, my mentoring professor, the fact that these type of folks argue that abstract objects are not a plausible ultimate, that they need an explanation, implies that, according to them, God is a more plausible explanation than these abstract objects. God just seems to fit the bill better as the ultimate stopping point. A being that's infinite, necessary, concrete, and most importantly, as we've seen, the big difference is he's a causal being. Abstract objects are non-causal, remember? So if God is the ultimate, then he, as a causal agent, could cause everything else that exists, including somehow be the source of these abstract objects, these truths. Now sometimes, the way this conversation goes, and even with Wielenberg, I got one more slide, and then I'll let you guys discuss for a while. Sometimes the conversation goes like this. So somebody on Wielenberg's side might say, well, doesn't theism just boil down to brute facts too? I mean, don't you at the end of the day just have brute facts? Isn't your system ultimately just resting on a foundation of brute facts? Isn't your ultimate stopping point some sort of brute facts too? Brute facts about God, maybe? And we would just respond respectfully by saying, no, that's not how our system ends. That's not the ultimate stopping point in our system. Yes, obviously we believe there are brute facts about God. He's moral, loving, he exists, he's triune. But these are facts about a concrete being. It's God that's ultimate. God, a concrete being, he's the ultimate, not facts about him. The facts are simply descriptions of what God is like. So we would say that God, at least according to our theory, is the ultimate, not facts about him. And that's different than Wielenberg, because Wielenberg is just positing that there's these facts that exist on their own. And there's a world of difference between positing facts about God, a concrete being, and positing facts that somehow exist abstractly on their own with no foundation. There's a difference there. Now, of course, Wielenberg's free to propose that, just like Zach is free to propose that there's a draft at the door, right? Anybody's free to throw their hat in the ring and put out their theory, right? It just doesn't seem, at least to me and others, very plausible. It doesn't seem like a good explanation, that it doesn't fit reason, logic, evidence, these lines of argument. We would say it doesn't seem to be a good theory, that these facts could exist on their own without any cause or foundation or explanation. They don't seem to be a good stopping point. All right, so I'm going to give you guys a discussion question now to chat in groups. And here it is. What do you think of this objection to Wielenberg's theory? I'm calling it here tonight the bloated non-naturalism objection. So do you think this is a strong objection? And remember, atheists, naturalists use this objection against Wielenberg, and so do theists, right? So, do you think this is a good objection, a strong one, or not? Well, remember, I know I don't give you much time, but remember, these are just supposed to be the beginning of conversations. So meet tomorrow for coffee, continue the conversation. Afterwards you can stay until Kristen kicks you out tonight, I guess, and have those conversations. So these are just supposed to be the beginning of conversations, right? So let's move on. I think we have enough time if you guys can stomach it. We'll look at one more objection to Wielenberg's theory. And this is called, and he refers to it himself as the lucky coincidence objection, okay? And this might have to do more about moral knowledge, whereas the first objection had to do more about reality or ontology or metaphysics, if you will, what really exists. This has to do more with epistemology, human knowledge. How can we know things, okay? And a good theory should be able to cover both issues, right? And so this would be an attack or a criticism of his theory that has to do with moral knowledge. So here's how it goes. I'll give it to you in a nutshell here. Basically, it says, look, even if I grant, for the sake of argument, that there are these brute ethical facts out there, okay, let's say, for the sake of argument, that I'm going to agree with you, and yeah, okay, these brute ethical facts, these abstract objects, they exist out there, but you know it would be quite a lucky coincidence if our moral knowledge, our moral understanding, happened to match up correctly with those facts, right? Remember, these abstract objects are not causal. They can't cause things. So it's not like they can cause us to believe what is true, right? They're out there, so to speak. So a difficulty comes with how can we know them? And this goes all the way back to Plato's original theory of how we could know about the forms. How could we know about these universals, these objective truths? And so this is just taking that objection, that criticism, and applying it to Wielenberg's theory, since it is Platonic. Wielenberg himself summed it up well. He said that if moral facts do not explain the moral beliefs of human beings, and they can't cause our beliefs. They're non-causal. So if they can't explain our moral beliefs, then those beliefs, those moral beliefs we have being correct, would involve a lucky coincidence that is incompatible with genuine knowledge. Okay, and this is a problem for a theory. If we can't know these moral truths that we're positing, then we run into a problem with the theory. Now, he recognizes, and so in his book even here, he talks about, he recognizes that his readers may be worried that his theory entails that we're remarkably lucky, coincidentally lucky, that our moral beliefs line up with this objective moral truth that's out there. So in the final section of his book, section 410, which he called How Lucky Are We?, he wrote that because my account entails lots of lucky coincidences and other metaethical theories don't entail such coincidences, my theory has a weakness that those other theories lack. And again, it's not just Christians, it's not just theists who have pushed this objection to Wielenberg's theory, okay? He admitted it's not only theistic philosophers who have found robust normative realism to be problematic. A number of contemporary non-theist philosophers charge that robust normative realism runs into trouble when it comes to try to account or explain for correct human moral knowledge. Now, if this is getting a little bit esoteric, let me give you something additional that I think drives it home, okay? Because a lot of people have argued that this problem, it's a problem all on its own. It goes all the way back to Plato's original theory of the forms, okay? But there's something that amplifies this problem, and that is evolution. So this problem is amplified for somebody if they believe that our moral beliefs have come about via a haphazard evolutionary process, which many atheists do, including Wielenberg. Now, even if somebody doesn't affirm evolution, this is still a problem. The lucky coincidence objection can't be avoided just by rejecting evolution. Evolution just exacerbates the problem. And let me explain why. So those who believe that our moral beliefs came about through an evolutionary process, they would say that our moral beliefs are just really, like everything in evolution, accidents. Accidents that nature selected because they increased our prospects for survival and or reproduction. So as the story goes, according to evolutionists, there were groups down through history who could compete better with other groups if they developed certain moral beliefs. Reciprocity, taking care of each other, and that gave them an evolutionary advantage over other groups. And that's where our moral beliefs came from. It moved from just, the alpha male, which nobody could defeat, to more group evolutionary dynamics, where if you get a group of 10 people working together well, they could take down any one alpha strong male. And so group dynamics actually took over on the evolutionary process rather than just pure biological toughness, if you understand what I'm saying. So this group dynamics, working together, morality. So if evolution came, or if our moral beliefs came from evolution, just this haphazard, accidental process, you could see how this would multiply or amplify the problem of how our moral beliefs just happen to work out through evolution to match up exactly with these brute ethical facts that have existed for all eternity past, right? Because our evolutionary path might have taken a different course very easily, according to evolutionists, and then we would have very different moral beliefs. So boy, aren't we lucky that our path worked out just so well so that we have the moral beliefs that have always existed from all eternity past. Do you see the lucky coincidence there? So evolution just makes it worse. Here's a classic quote from an evolutionary philosopher down at Florida, Michael Roos. He said, "The position of the modern evolutionists is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation no less than our hands or feet or teeth. Ethics is illusory. I appreciate it when somebody says, 'Love thy neighbor as thyself.' They think they're referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such references are truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory, an illusion." And if I'm honest, I would say, if atheism and evolution are true, I have a hard time seeing how he's wrong. Okay? So if you grant evolution and atheism, then I would have to agree with that. So that's the lucky coincidence. Okay? If there are these objective moral truths out there, it seems quite a lucky coincidence if our moral beliefs just happen to match up correctly with them, given that the evolutionary process which made us could have taken all sorts of different paths, right? Evolution selects for survival and reproduction, not for knowing truth, especially moral truth. So here's another well-known quote. It's long, I apologize, but it's so good and helpful, and that's why it's become so famous. Sharon Street is a philosopher. I think she's at Stanford. I could be wrong. But Sharon Street wrote this. This really clears it up, I think. She said, "Allowing our evaluative judgments, our moral beliefs, to be shaped by evolutionary influences is analogous to settling out for Bermuda and letting the course of your boat be determined by the wind and tides. Just as the push of the wind and tides on your boat has nothing to do with where you want to go, so the historical push of natural selection on the content of our moral judgments has nothing to do with moral truth, if there is such a thing. Of course, it's possible that as a matter of sheer chance, some large portion of our evaluative judgments ended up true due to a happy coincidence between the real moral realists' independent moral truths and the moral directions in which natural selection tended to push us. But this would require a fluke of luck that's not only extremely unlikely in view of the huge universe of logically possible moral judgments and truths, but also astoundingly convenient to the moral realist." So as far as I know, Sharon Street is an atheist who rejects moral realism. She doesn't believe in objective morality. And so she's pushing back on theories like Wielenberg's and saying, look, it seems very ad hoc what you're proposing. It seems like there's just such a lucky coincidence here that your theory just doesn't hold water. I'm going to give you another long quote, but this is from Charles Darwin. And he, from the very beginning, saw this. Okay, when he proposed his theory of evolution, he recognized that if our evolutionary path would have taken a different course, then we would have very, very different moral beliefs. Okay? I mean, I think if you accept evolution, you have to accept that. So this is from Charles Darwin. He said, this is a famous example of his about hive bees. He said, look, if men were reared under the same condition as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. Nevertheless, the bee or any other social animal would gain, in our supposed case, some feeling of right or wrong, or a conscience, maybe. For each individual would have an inward sense of possessing certain stronger or enduring instincts, and others less strong or enduring. In this case, an inward monitor would tell the animal that it would have been better to have followed the one impulse rather than the other. The one course ought to have been followed and the other not. The one would have been right and the other wrong. Just an example of, look, if evolution is how we came about our moral beliefs, it could have gone in all sorts of different directions. So why think that our moral beliefs just happen to get lucky and line up with these root ethical facts that have supposedly existed timelessly? Enoch, similar to Wielenberg's theory, says the same thing. It's indeed true that the causal forces shaping our intellectual and other normative faculties seem very different. Had they aimed at things that are of no value at all, or that are of disvalue, we would have been systematically mistaken in our normative beliefs. And we are indeed epistemically lucky that this presumably isn't the case. So yes, some brute luck may remain. Enoch even called the fact that our moral beliefs do line up with objective moral truth, so we think, a miracle. And after trying to respond different ways to this lucky coincidence objection, Enoch wrote, "Let me not give the impression that this suggested way I've given of coping with the challenge is ideal. Indeed, because of perhaps the remaining small miracle, perhaps my theory, robust realism, does lose some plausibility points here." So they admit this is an issue for their theory. Now, the last thing I want to point out, just two more slides. Theism doesn't face this problem, right? Quote from Wielenberg. You know, there's one view out there that might seem to require much less luck for moral knowledge than my view does, and that's our old friend, theism. So, whether you're a theist who believes in evolution or not, right? Some Christians do, some don't. But either way, you have a God behind the scenes, if you will, orchestrating such things such that people develop the moral beliefs that line up with objective moral truth. Does that make sense? That's why theism wouldn't have this problem. One last quote and we'll be done. This is from Robert Adams. We talked about him. He's been a philosophy professor many, many different places. Most longest, I believe, he was at Yale. But he wrote that if we suppose that God directly or indirectly, through evolution maybe, causes human beings to regard as excellent approximately those things that are godlike, moral, in a relevant way, it follows that there is a causal and an explanatory connection between the facts, moral facts of excellence, and the beliefs that we have of those facts that we may regard as justified about excellence, these moral facts. And hence, it would be no accident that such beliefs are correct when they are. So, theists don't have the lucky coincidence objection. It wouldn't apply to their theory. All right, so I'll let you guys discuss for a few minutes and then I'll wrap it up. So discuss this objection. What do you think about it? Do you agree? Do you disagree? You think it's a strong objection? Why or why not? All right, go ahead.